Nelson Mandela once said, negotiation and discussion are the greatest weapon we have for promoting peace and development. This quote resonated with the group, so we decided to choose topic E, learning about negotiation from history. Landmark negotiation from around the world. Slide suivante, please. Was written by Emmanuel Vivet, a research associate at IREN, and was published in 2019. This book analyzes negotiations from all around the world. It focuses on their overlap and analyzes past and present negotiations with their consequences. Emmanuel tells us about the actions and ideas that made the negotiation either a success or a failure.
So now I'm going to talk about the fact that we can learn from historical negotiation despite the passage of centuries or even millennia. So the fundamental principles of negotiation and diplomacy dealing with conflicts, managing power dynamics, and finding compromises are universal and timeless. So first of all, we can learn from past events that negotiation strategies such as compromise, leverage, trust building, and diplomatic persuasion are fundamental. These strategies transcend time because they are rooted in the logic of resolving conflict between parties with differing interests. So, for example, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30-year war in Europe and introduced the principle of state sovereignty. So the success of this negotiation hinged on compromise with multiple Catholic and Protestant powers, giving up certain demands to achieve lasting peace. So moreover, for the relevance of enduring negotiation principles today, compromise and leveraging positions are essential tools in resolving conflicts between nations, whether the issue is about trade agreements, territorial disputes, or arms control. So a second key element that we can learn from negotiation happening hundreds of years ago is that ancient negotiation often demonstrate the importance of long-term thinking, considering future consequences rather than just immediate outcomes. So the modern diplomacy can benefit from looking at past cases where short-term victories led to long-term challenges or where a durable peace was achieved through careful strategic planning. So as an example, the Roman Empire policy of granting citizenship to conquered people negotiated through alliance allowed the empire to integrate diverse cultures and maintain stability for centuries. So this long-term strategic approach helped to secure the empire borders. So the relevance of this principle today is that modern negotiation in international relations often require forward-thinking solutions that address not only present issues, but also anticipate the future needs. So the third lesson that we can learn from history is full of diplomatic failures that offer cautionary tales. So the breakdown of negotiation due to miscommunication, lack of cultural sensitivity, underestimation of the other party's strength are instructive as successful treaties. So these lessons in what not to do can be just as valuable. And for example, the Munich Agreement in 1938 is often cited as an example of the dangers of appeasement as it failed to prevent World War II. So British and French diplomats underestimated Hitler's ambition and believed that conceding territory would prevent further conflict. So modern negotiators can learn from this by recognizing that appeasing an aggressive power without securing meaningful concession can have devastating long-term consequences. So the book also highlights diplomatic failures that offer important lessons, and failed negotiation often reveal what happens when key factors like trust, communication, or compromise are ignored. Analyzing these failures provide a blueprint for what to avoid in the future diplomatic efforts. So as an example, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was to prevent future conflict, and it was largely due to its punitive measures against Germany, and it stands as a powerful example of how imbalanced and harsh terms can show the seeds for future discourse. So with this example, we understand that modern diplomacy can learn from these mistakes by emphasizing fairness, inclusivity, and forward thinking in the negotiation process. So avoiding overly punitive agreements and recognizing the importance of long-term peace building are key takeaways. So despite the timeless value of many negotiation principles, some aspects of ancient diplomacy may not directly apply to the modern context, so there are some limitations. The first limitation is different political and social contexts. So in ancient or in medieval times, negotiation involved monarch, emperors, or small elites who held absolute power. And at that time, decision-making was centralized and diplomacy could be conducted in secret. In contrast, the modern diplomacy is shaped by democratic processes, transparency, and the influence of media. So, as I said before, for the negotiation of the Treaty of Versailles, it was shaped by public opinion and the press in a way that earlier treaties negotiated in closed bedroom by monarchs. And today, the modern diplomats must navigate democratic oversight, international law, and global media scrutiny. And the second limitation is technological and economic changes. So globalization with internet, nuclear weapons, for example, have drastically altered the nature of international relations. So, for example, the Paris Agreement in 2015 involved nearly 200 nations negotiating complex environmental and economic policies that require modern scientific understanding and technology to implement. So in fact, the relevance of this today is that while ancient treaties resolve territorial disputes or secure peace, modern negotiations often tackles issues that transcend borders and requires collective global action, so something ancient diplomacy never faced. So we can learn, in fact, that valuable lesson from negotiations that took place 100 or 1,000 years ago, and the consistency of human nature and enduring principle of negotiation provide rich insights into managing conflicts and diplomacy. However, modern diplomats must adapt this lesson to fit challenges of the present, including democratic processes, globalization, and technological advancements. And to sum up, by blending historical wisdom with modern realities, negotiators can improve their ability to achieve sustainable solutions.
Now that we can learn from past negotiations, let's go deeper into the book and draw out the lessons Emmanuel Vivet has set out to teach us. First, there are flexibility and adaptability. Diplomatic context evolves, and negotiators must be willing to pivot and adjust their strategies to suit new realities. Rigidity often leads to failure, while flexibility can open the door to breakthroughs. For example, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War in Europe and established a new framework for political order in Europe, recognizing the sovereignty of states and the need for mutual recognition between different religious and political factions. The adaptability of the negotiating parties to shift their positions helps establish an enduring peace in a divided Europe. Thus, adaptability is crucial in modern diplomatic settings where the global landscape is constantly shifting. Leaders must be flexible in their approaches, allowing room for compromise and innovation in negotiations, whether dealing with economic sanctions, international trade agreements, or environmental treaties. Then it is important to build trust and relationships. Indeed, without trust, even the most well-crafted treaties can collapse. A recurring theme in past negotiation is the role of personal relationships between leaders or diplomats in smoothing tensions and ensuring agreements are honored. Here is an example. During the Camp David Accords, trust building between Egyptian president and Israeli prime minister was a critical element in the peace negotiations, while their countries had been adversaries for decades. Personal interaction at the negotiating table helped to bridge differences and secure a peace treaty that has endured. In today's world, the human element, trust, communication, and relationship building remains key to successful diplomacy. While technology and global forums play a larger role, personal diplomacy remains a vital tool in resolving conflicts. Moreover, one of the most profound lessons from historical negotiations is the importance of cultural sensitivity. Unsaid treaties and peace agreements were often made across different cultural, religious, and social lines, and the success of these negotiations frequently depended on the ability of diplomats to understand and respect those differences, such as the Treaty of Nerkinsk, signed between the Russian Empire and the dynasty of China. Negotiators had to overcome linguistic barriers, differing political systems, and contrasting worldviews. The treaty was successfully concluded by recognizing each other's cultural protocols and finding a mutual acceptable resolution to a territorial dispute. Nowadays, cultural awareness and sensitivity are critical. Whether dealing with economic sanctions, climate agreements, or peace treaties, understanding the cultural values and historical context of the party involved helps avoid misunderstandings and foster cooperations. To finish, it is important to seize the value of mediators and third-party actors. Neutral parties can facilitate negotiations by providing an impartial perspective, ensuring fairness, and bridging gaps between conflicting sides. The role of Jimmy Carter as mediator in the Camp David Accords illustrates how a neutral third party can help break deadlocks and foster trust. He helped Israel and Egypt to find common ground. Nowadays, third-party mediation remains a powerful tool for resolving disputes. The United Nations, for instance, often plays the role of mediator in conflict zones and peace negotiations.
All right. So the first case study that we chose to look at, I don't know if you can see me. Wait. So the first case study that we chose to do was on the very famous Congress of Vienna, which happened 25 years after 25 years of brutal conquest from the Napoleonic Empire in all of Europe. So it happened in the beginning of the 19th century, and the main aim of this Congress was to restore balance and stability in Europe after decades of war. The goal was to avoid the comeback of revolutions, which were happening everywhere in Europe. So there was also a new ideological point into this. And the main power that were involved were, of course, Austria, Britain, Russia, Prussia, which were the big winners of these wars. But there was also France, which is first the losing country, being part of the negotiation table. And there's also other countries, much smaller, that were still involved because, once again, the span of these wars was in all of Europe. So it was very important to involve every possible stakeholder. So once again, the objective was to prevent further French aggression. There were still remnants of the empire, and we saw it with Napoleon coming back a few years later. Was also at the time, once again, revolutions with revolutionaries in every country, propelled by French, but still acting as cells and able to do on their own. And finally, there was the objective to establish a long-term peaceful situation in Europe through diplomacy. So this was the development of more diplomatic alliances, big innovation at the time, but also the idea of having a stable continent-wide system. Now, for the main tactic used, so the main point was the balance of power principle. The idea was to have every country be as powerful as possible compared to others, meaning that we will be in a situation where everyone could not destroy each other like in the Cold War, but still be able to inflict pain on the others if they decide to act on their own. So countries will have to work through alliances and thus through diplomacy. The tactic used for this was coalition building. So when it comes to coalition building, you will have of course, the bigger countries working all together, but also smaller one. For example, we know that Germany was getting closer to Austria at the time to try to still make their voice heard. And there was also the compromise and inclusivity that was a big part of this through, once again, the historical situation with having France, the big loser of these wars, being in the table during the discussions. This is mainly due to Talleyrand's work managing to still convince the winners to accept France at the table, to have their voice. And so this led to, as you can see, many discussions on journals. I added some caricatures into this where you can see that all the countries worked together. Some were more happy than others. Of course, the smaller countries still ended up not having all the power that they could have. So yeah, it was a very important part of this negotiation, and this led to a very positive result because we ended up with close to, I believe, 20 or 30 years of peace in Europe, which was unprecedented. The lessons that we can take out of the Congress of Vienna is, of course, first, inclusivity brings stability. It's complicated to find a stable situation when not all the stakeholders are included in the conversation. This was a mistake that was done later during the Treaty of Versailles, in which, although Germany was there, it was treated as a loser, and the European winners ended up taking a lot out of the losing countries, which brought to the Second World War a few decades later. So it's to bring stability is very important to hear the needs and the demands from every stakeholder in order to find a common balance. This also means that in order to find this inclusivity, the winner countries have to accept to take the equivalent of losses in short term, meaning that they can't expect to get everything out of the accord. They will have to give some leeway to loser country in order to not foster more resentment. And the second lesson, very important lesson, is the balance of power that creates lasting stability. So the idea is that there shouldn't be power concentrated in a few countries or a few stakeholders in this situation, as this kind of situation leads to more headbutting and also the ability for stronger power to do as they want, once again fostering more resentment on the loser side, which bring, of course, war in different situations, or it can also bring bad business deal if you're into a business table. So yeah, now I will let Pauline describe the case of the first UK Embassy of China negotiation that didn't succeed.
Thank you, Baptiste. So as Baptiste introduced, we'll start the second case for this presentation, and it's about the first UK embassy to China, otherwise called as the Macartney Embassy, which happened in 1793 in Beijing, China. So in terms of historical context, the 18th century, Britain was importing a large volume of products from China, and that included tea, silk, and porcelain. and that led to a significant trade imbalance for Britain. So in answer to that significant trade imbalance, the King George III decided to send an embassy to China, which was led by Lord Macartney. And the goal of this embassy was really to establish formal diplomatic relations and to negotiate better trading terms by reducing the restrictions which are imposed by the Canton system, which really limited the British access to Chinese goods. And then on the other side of the negotiation table was the Qing dynasty, which was at the time ruling over China. And in this negotiation, that was represented by the Emperor Qianlong. So it's very important to mention that at the time, China was actually very self-sufficient, and therefore they saw very little need to enhance the trade relations that they had with Britain. And this difference in perspective really set the stage for a highly challenging negotiation. Moving on to the next slide. So the negotiation actually took place in form of diplomatic interactions, which were based on symbols of respect and protocols. And one of the key points of contention during the negotiation was actually a ceremonial protocol that was known as the kowtow. So the kowtow was when a person would bow on both knees with the forehead touching to the ground. And that was really non-negotiable at the time for the China court's perspective, since it was an act of respect and recognition for the Chinese supremacy. However, the Lord Macartney actually refused to perform the kowtow, and instead he insisted on bowing on one knee like he would in front of his own king. So in his thought, that was really a gesture representing the British sovereignty and a desire for equality in diplomatic dealings. However, the refusal to perform the full kowtow highlighted a deep cultural divide between the British and the Chinese, and also led to the breakdown of the negotiations. So despite Macartney's efforts, the embassy actually ended in a failure. And Emperor Qianlong actually rejected all the British demands for this negotiation, and he sent a letter to the King George III, reiterating that China was actually fully self-sufficient and dismissing the need for any expanded trade relations with Britain. So moving on to the next slide, we'll see what are the key takeaways that we can take from the Macartney embassy. The first lesson is about cultural differences and misunderstandings. This case really highlights that a failure to understand or to respect cultural norms and values can be disastrous in diplomacy and in negotiations, and that cultural sensitivity is critical in international negotiations. The second lesson is about the power of symbols. So the symbols, like in this case, the kowtow, actually play a vital role in negotiations, and therefore negotiations should be really aware of the symbolic weights of certain actions, as they can impact the progress of the talks and even end in the failure of the talks, as in this case. The third lesson is about hierarchy. So in certain cultures, ranks and status are critical to the negotiation process. Here, as we discussed, the Qing dynasty really viewed Britain as another tributary state, while the British actually came seeking for equal diplomatic treatment. And so this difference in perception created an inherent imbalance, and it's a reminder that successful negotiation must account for differing views on hierarchy and on power. And the last lesson that we can take away is about rigid negotiation tactics. So in the end, the embassy really failed because both sides were highly inflexible, meaning that neither the British or the Chinese were willing to make concessions or find a compromise. So this case really illustrates the importance of being flexible and the willingness to create a negotiated outcome that benefits both parties. Rigid approaches can often lead to failure in negotiation, whether it's through business negotiations or through diplomatic negotiations. So as we've seen in this course, adaptable strategies should often be prioritized as they can foster long-term relationships. And now Faliha will move on to the third and final case.
Thanks, Pauline. So on to the final case, we talk about the case of Darfur crimes and no impunity in the case of Darfur. We will cover the negotiation strategies that were taken by UN Security Council or UNSC, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and the other state delegations, such as the French mission, the UK, the US. So to shed a bit of background, this situation involves UNSC, ICC, the key state delegations on passing the security resolution. The other important background of this case is, of course, the conflict in Darfur, which is a genocide involving the systemic killing of ethnic Darfuri people during the war. It began in 2003, and it involves two opposing groups, the persecuted people of Darfuri groups, as well as the government of Sudan, which is the Sudan Liberation Army. So as Vivek mentioned, it's important to observe the political and social context at the time, which is in the period of early 2000s. This is when the President Bush of US entered his second term of administration. And at the time, he was very hostile towards the International Criminal Court, showing a lot of hostility, and that affected a lot of the negotiation strategy later on, taken on by the French mission. On the other hand, there was also a lot of hostility from African countries who had started distancing themselves from ICC, and that influenced the Darfur crimes significantly, given the number of prosecutions that ICC had issued out towards African head states. So on to the next slide. The case essentially focused on the success in which the negotiation was successfully done by the French representative in passing the resolution 1593, which basically meant that they had authorized the referral of the situation to ICC for further investigation. So in short, this was really a watershed moment for the new court in its early stages, as well as for the Security Council and US relationships to it. Afterwards, ICC also had began the prosecution of a former leader of the pro-government Janjaweed militia, and it began the 31 counts of war crimes and the crimes against humanity. So essentially, that had a long-standing impact on international scene, as it marked the importance of international mandate against war crimes and the impunity of state actors. So this trial, however, even though the case happened in 2005, the trial began in 2022, nearly 20 years after the violence in Darfur. On top of that, the arrest wasn't executed, as the perpetrator had to voluntarily surrender himself to ICC custody in 2020. So those are the subsequent developments of the case. But on to the key negotiators. The case involved, as mentioned before, UNSC, the ICC, the French mission being the leader in the case, the US mission, who had strong opposing views towards the goal of the French mission, as well as the other states, the state delegations who had the vote towards the resolution. So on to the next slide, I will discuss the goals of each sides. So for the French mission in the United States, they had a clear goal, which is to refer the Darfur situation to the ICC. On the other hand, the US mission, given that the US government has long criticized ICC's statute for bringing charges against its own citizens, they were focused on vetoing, since they also were a permanent member to the UNSC with a veto right. So there were several risks that came forward, which is potential member states abstaining from the resolution or political stalemate regarding the Darfur war crimes case. So Vivek discussed two very important approaches that made this negotiation a success. One was the careful preparation. So how they handled this was that the French mission had accurately analyzed the political situation, the risk appetite of other states, and for example, China and Russia's intent to keep a low profile. They also assessed how Bush administration, even though they were a key player in the negotiation, were under a lot of pressure. So even though they were hostile towards the ICC, regarding protecting their citizens, they weren't in the right position to block the resolution because they could be subject to harsh criticism. So there was also a key point on consolidating coalition building with other 9 states in order to isolate the US. On the other hand, there was a important approach of doing things in a sequential manner, as they had made it clear, the French mission made it clear from the beginning that there was no alternative, and the referral to ICC was the main objective. Under that approach, they also took on different tactics, such as the French representative doing an informal preliminary draft resolution, which made sure that he could act quicker and swifter, and made it easier to react rather than running into a stalemate in the discussions. So in conclusion, the lessons from the success of Resolution 1593, as is the case, sorry, next slide. As is the case for situations with a lot of tension and conflict in interests, making a decision very early is important because it then allows for more room for concession after that. So even though the French mission had made it clear at the beginning, they were able to make meaningful concessions in response to the US, and they never lost control over the procedure and had a genuine roadmap. Another important learning point was the coalition building by preserving unity with other delegations, by having constant communication. That way they were able to easily respond to US in their attempts to intimidate the other states into abstaining against the resolution. Third would be the determination during the pivotal moment when US had rejected the resolution. France continued to submit the draft resolution, and that played a big role in making it a success. Fourth is important for modern diplomacy, as we often see political stalemates. But in this case, the French representative played a tactic, which was to act independently, and that made the negotiations a lot quicker. Lastly is the long-term aspect of decision-making during the negotiation, as in this case, the Darfur crimes case was a dream case for the ICC, as quoted, is because that they were setting a precedent for the future of the court. And as they are a well-established institution, the French mission as well as the other state delegations knew that this was important to reconcile their interests and to work towards the important goal, which is to refer the war crimes to the ICC so that it can create a success case for future international law. So that I end my presentation on the Darfur case. Just to summarize very quickly, on the next slide, with this book and our deep dive into the 3 case studies, we learned what worked and what didn't work in historical negotiations. And we also presented to you the key strategies which are critical for negotiators in adjusting their strategies in modern diplomacy, regardless of the era or the time, but subject to social, political, and cultural context. So, cultural context. And we hope that these provide you a key understanding of potential applications for modern diplomacy. Thank you.